Thanks for joining us today for this fabulous session around unpacking SCHADS. And I'm glad it's not me having to provide the content, so as you ladies. So I'm as interested as everyone else for the session. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Kylie Hogan. I'm part of the industry and workforce development team at CheckUP. And if you're not aware of who CheckUP is, we're a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to improving the health and wellbeing of people and communities who need it the most and within those communities. And we do that through a range of initiatives across the health and community services sector. I guess the two most relevant probably for the group of people here today is our industry workforce advisor program, which is funded through Department of Trade, Employment and Training, and that's around supporting businesses with their workforce planning. And then the other one is NDIS Business Connect, and that's funded through the Queensland Government Disability Peak Funding Program, and that's a capacity and capability building project for new and existing sole traders and small businesses that are providing supports in Queensland for people with disability. But there's lots of information on our website, and we'll be able to send some of that information out when we send the resources for the program. So I'm not keen to take up any more of the time because you're all here to hear from the lovely ladies from EffectiveHR around unpacking SCHADS. So I'm going to hand back over to you, and thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Kylie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar in collaboration with CheckUP. As we know, the SCHADS Award, it can be one of the most complex modern awards, and navigating its nuances is often a challenge for many businesses, whether it's managing rosters, interpreting classifications, or staying updated with compliance changes. Keeping everything aligned can feel overwhelming. And that's exactly why today's webinar is designed to bring clarity and confidence to the key areas of the award that impact your daily operations. We're here to help you break down the complexities and ensure that you have a solid understanding to support your business in managing compliance effectively. Now, today's session is being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit the content or share it with your team after the webinar. Now, before we proceed, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all work today. I pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar. I also acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging for their ongoing contributions to our communities. Now, before we dive in, we'd also love to introduce ourselves. I'm Emma, a HR consultant at EffectiveHR, and I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Corinne, our lead HR consultant. Between us, we've spent many years supporting businesses just like yours, particularly in the NDIS and community services space, navigating everything from HR to safety to payroll compliance, and often the confusing world of the SCHADS Award. Now, in today's session, we'll be focusing on the key elements of the SCHADS Award that are most relevant to your day-to-day operations, including streams, classifications, and pay points, along with engagement, broken shifts, breaks, sleepovers, remote work, and work health and safety obligations. At the end of the session, we will open the floor for a Q&A, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we will address as many as possible during our interactive discussion. I'll hand it over now to Corinne, who will take us through the technical content.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to dive straight in and looking at an overview of the SCHADS Award because it can get confusing even from the start. What's really important to understand here is that the SCHADS Award actually contains 4 sectors within it. For our NDIS providers, you're most likely going to be looking at our social and community services sector or our home care sector, which now has 2 substreams being disability care and aged care to cover your organisations. We also have the family daycare scheme sector and our crisis assistance and supported housing sector. I do spend most of my days working with clients that are covered by this award, and there is a lot of confusion out there. So understanding that the Home Care Award, it's not something separate, it's still contained within that SCHADS Award. Same as the social and community services sector. It's not a separate award. It is all still contained within the SCHADS Award. However, that stream or sector differentiation can actually have a big impact on determining entitlements for our team members. So it is really important that we get it right. So the graphic that you're seeing on the screen right now is what needs to be determined in order to be confident that you are paying each employee correctly. So while that top line of determining what sector applies to an organisation as a whole, so not at any particular employee or client or shift, but as a business, as an organisation, what is our primary purpose? What are our core service deliveries? That is how we determine our sectors. Once we have determined that and applied that to the organisation as a whole, we can then start looking at our classifications, which are contained at the back of the award in the schedules. So Schedule B for our SAC stream and E and F for our home care streams. And we are reading those classifications to determine which is most appropriate for any particular employee. So you may have a general range of classifications that you use to cover the bulk of your team members, say a support worker role. However, there's a bit more that goes into, instead of just saying, right, we're a support worker level 1 or level 2, exactly what does that look like to get those right rates of pay? So if we go back to basics and go, who should be covered by home care? Who should be covered by SACs, and what's the difference? This is something that I see a lot of people get wrong. So if you're listening to this and feeling a little bit worried, it's okay. You're not the only one, and we can work it out together. Generally speaking, and provided for under the definition section at clause 3 of the award, our home care sector is designed and defined to cover more of that core supports and daily assistance that's completed in a client's private residence. So this is focused on domestic assistance, home maintenance, and personal care duties. So the basic requirements each day. Whereas our SACS stream, so our social and community services sector, it's defined to cover more community-based capacity building, recreational activities, support coordination services, provision of SIL and STA, is generally what we would find under the SACS sector, those types of businesses. What's really interesting is this area is very nuanced. We work quite closely with the Fair Work Ombudsman Direct to be getting advice on a case-by-case basis to ensure compliance and understanding of how the award is interpreted here. What's really interesting and what I've seen with a recent client is, even though they were going into the client's home and they didn't leave the home all day, the nature of the support that they were providing was not based on that personal care, but based on that psychosocial support, which we found actually to fall outside the definition of the home care sector. So even though they rarely left the home, they were actually covered by the social and community services stream. So that's just one example of why this is so important to get it right. I often get asked if we can use both streams to cover our workforce. If we've got some people doing our home care duties, some people doing our SACS duties. My default answer is to say no. I'm not saying it's impossible, but generally speaking, an organisation as a whole is going to fit into one of those categories. It would only be if we're looking at, I guess, a more technical discipline with award coverage of whether or not we have a dual substantive character for that organisation, that we might look at doing something like that. For our clerical employees, there's plenty of coverage under the social and community services sector for our organisations covered there. Our home care, it's quite nuanced, and we need to look at on a case-by-case basis. Previously, there was advice from the regulator saying that admin were not covered under home care. However, that research article we often relied on has magically disappeared from the library website there. And so it is something that we really need to be looking at the direct text and analysing who's covered by what. In terms of why this stuff matters, why are we talking about it today? Why have we all gathered to go through it? That award coverage and the classification levels form the basis for employee entitlements. So our classification is going to tell us what level we're on. Our pay points is going to tell us within that level what pay point we're at, and that's governed by clause 13.3 of the SCHADS Award. It also tells us how we may be eligible to progress from pay point to pay point. And we also need that final determination of whether an employee is a shift worker or a day worker to complete that piece of the puzzle. We'll look at that a little bit more detail shortly. The reason why this is important is because if it's wrong, we're going to not be compliant. And that's a big deal when we think about now looking at criminal liability for underpaying staff, as well as fines for non-compliance. So we really want to make sure that this foundation is correct. There's a significant variance in the rates of pays in the home care sector versus the SACS sector. The way certain provisions are applied. So if we're working in community services in SACS, but not in disability services, we can't use broken shifts. Very simple things like that just won't apply. So this is why it's important that we get our stream and sector determination right so that we are building from a strong foundation. In terms of that classification and pay point progression, I often get asked the question of what comes first. Do I look at someone's classification, or do I look at someone's rate of pay, or agree on a rate of pay, potentially with a new employee coming on board? What I see happen a lot is we'll find a great candidate to recruit. We're going to hit it off instantly. We're going to find out what they worked at their old job, agree on a rate of pay, probably the same, if not higher, to get them to come over and work for you. And then the deal's done. We go back to the award, we check the pay guide, we find the rate closest to that, and that's their classification. A lot of people do that. Unfortunately, it's wrong, and it's back to front. What we need to do is we need to start at the classification level first. So when I talk about reading those classification schedules, I'm reading them almost as if they're a position description. So potentially comparing it to an existing position or understanding someone's roles to go, what is your roles, your qualifications, perhaps your experience, your tenure? What's the supervision structure more broadly in the organisation from which this role will report? From there, we're able to determine a classification level. Now, of course, you can offer someone higher than the rate of pay linked to that level, but that tells us the minimum that we can offer someone, and that's also what all our other entitlements can be calculated off. So we want to be clear that we know exactly what someone's classification is. I often get asked the question if we have to progress through pay points every 12 months. And again, referring to clause 13.3 here, what's really interesting is we've had a recent case law decision. So gone to the courts, tested, got some precedent to come out of that to explain what the bloody hell clause 13.3 is actually on about. And probably the key thing that came out of this is looking at the wording around every 12 months an employee is eligible. Keyword eligible, not entitled, eligible. It then goes on to tell us potential criteria that we're applying to move through pay points. In terms of the so what factor and what does that actually mean for you? Do I need to put someone's rate of pay up every year? Do I need to progress them through pay points every year? What does that look like? Firstly, our rates of pay are always going to go up on our end of financial year. So next week, we should have those updates done in payroll systems and make sure that you're across that. Secondly, pay point progressions, that's going to happen on someone's anniversary. So not necessarily the same time every year, like end of financial year. It's going to be different per employee. And my advice to you is to say the most conservative approach is to put someone up each year, and they will stop at the ceiling of the highest pay point. They won't then move to the next pay point. However, if there are grounds and there's good reason to hold someone back, let's systemize that process. Let's make sure as on their anniversary, we're actually doing a pay point progression review. We're completing a checklist and we're communicating with the employee for transparency to say, yes, you're going up, or no, you're staying the same, and this is why. That simple system can help mitigate so much risk in this area when it comes to making sure we've got the right rate of pay for each employee. And last piece of the puzzle I mentioned in terms of working out someone's rate of pay under the SCHADS Award is being confident for each employee to understand if you are a day worker or a shift worker. In accordance with the award, an employee is going to be a shift worker if the employer advises them in writing that they are a shift worker. Super helpful definition. And that's what we're working with. We do know, however, that our day workers span from 6 a.m. till 8 p.m. Monday to Sunday. We do know that our afternoon shifts are going to finish essentially after 8 o'clock or before midnight, Monday to Friday. Our night shifts are going to be finishing after midnight and commencing before 6 a.m. Monday to Friday. So I've got a bit of a scenario on the screen to test your knowledge here and how this matters. Sarah is a part-time day worker who is scheduled to work Tuesday, 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Her manager asks her to adjust her shift time on the day to 3:30 to 11:30 p.m. due to a staff shortage. And Sarah agrees to that change. She's happy to mix it up. She's got a 60-minute break in there as well. So my question to you would be, how does this affect what Sarah gets paid for that particular day? So if we have a think about it, as a day worker, because this new shift is now going after 8 p.m., all hours worked after 8 p.m. is considered overtime. So it's not going to be considered a night rate penalty because you are a day worker. Anything outside that span of 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. will be paid at overtime rates, okay? That could also potentially impact if we've got a guarantee of ordinary hours. Overtime hours are not ordinary hours, so we need to think about that from a rostering compliance perspective as well. If Sarah was a shift worker and was working this shift, the entire length of the shift would be paid at that afternoon shift rate, so 12.5% loading. So not just from 8 p.m. onwards, but from 3:30 p.m., a whole shift. So we can see how if we've incorrectly classified someone, we're incorrectly applying loadings and overtime to each person's shift. So we need to make sure that that's correct in our systems as well. Maximum and minimum hours of engagement is where we move to next. So this is governed by the SCHADS Award, something we need to be across. And what I find really interesting is that the default here of the maximum hours I can work is 8 hours. A lot of people know 10. And yes, the award allows us to increase it to 10, but it needs to be by agreement. So I'll ask you from a record keeping perspective, where does that agreement live? Where is that written? Us, we like incorporating every award by agreement clause into a contract of employment to be able to comfortably tick that box and roster someone up to 10 hours without creating a headache for ourselves. For our minimum hours of engagement, generally speaking, we're looking at 2 hours. However, if you are a SACS employee and you're not performing disability services work, we're actually looking at 3 hours minimum engagement. So even if we have a team member that's potentially providing 1 hour of supports to a client, the award dictates that they get paid for a minimum of 2. So we want to be looking at things like this when auditing our rosters to make sure that we don't have any inefficient wage costs there and making sure someone is being paid their entitlements so that we reduce that risk of underpayment. Now I've got an interesting and quite common scenario on the screen here that we see pop up. We have John, who's a part-time disability support worker. He's scheduled to work a nice 3-hour shift from 10 till 1. However, at 11 a.m, he receives an urgent call from a neighbour informing him that there appears to be flooding in his house. Concerned about the situation, John calls his team leader and receives approval to leave work early after just 1 hour of his shift. How on earth are we meant to pay this? What does that look like? What I'm comfortable with here is that as an employer, we've met the minimum engagement requirements under the award because John was rostered for a 3-hour shift. So that's not an issue. We've met minimum engagement. However, what that should look like as the roster flows through to payroll is making sure that that last 2 hours is accounted for with a particular type of leave. Depending on the circumstances, whether that be approved personal/carers leave, annual leave, potentially unpaid leave, even if it is leave without pay or it's a casual employee, we still want to, from a record keeping perspective, be flagging that that was the original shift type. We don't want to lose that as part of our trail with covering a shift. Because at the end of the day, when we think about our record keeping obligations under the Fair Work Act, we must be able to pull out these timesheets, these rosters, these payslips for 7 years. So do we feel comfortable going back 6.5 years that we've got something that tells us John was rostered for the 3 hours originally? So really important that that's accounted for in our systems as well. This is probably my favorite, broken shifts. Emma, if I'm to nerd out on any particular one and pick a favorite, broken shifts and meal breaks. Now, generally speaking, we're all pretty well across and well versed with clause 27 of the award that tells us about how a worker is entitled to breaks. So working in excess of 5 hours, we're entitled to an unpaid meal break of 30 to 60 minutes. However, if we need to work during that break and beyond, we're potentially looking at overtime rates here. What I do like in this clause, though, is there's at least some common sense when it comes to the industry that allows us for when an employee is potentially having a meal with the client as part of their normal work routine, we can simply pay that at ordinary rate and count that as time worked. So we see that in systems often dictated as meal had with client. If that's what a meal break is, what is a broken shift? It's not defined, unfortunately, in the award. So it can be quite difficult to determine, and we'll look at that shortly. One other thing I see when it comes to working out with meal breaks, whether or not it's to be considered a break that's paid with the client or if it's an unpaid meal break. I like to look at that period of time to go, is that mine? So can I leave the site? Can I maybe do a cheeky Macca's run through the drive-through, post my ASOS return, go check out the surf, whatever it might be? Or do I still need to stay on site with the client, you know, even if they are simply resting or potentially having some downtime? If that time is my own, I'm comfortable with that being unpaid break. However, if I do need to stay on site and I'm potentially there, even if the client isn't in the same room, we should still look at that as the paid through the break period. I would recommend with that making sure those expectations are clear, and the best way to do that is through having a breaks policy, whether that be a standalone policy or incorporated into a bigger rostering policy framework, so that team members are clear on exactly what the expectations are when they're taking their breaks, so that we don't have people out in the field not understanding and potentially causing a liability for you down the track, which unfortunately we have seen before as well. So quite often we get asked the question when something is a meal break and when something is a broken shift. When we move into that realm of broken shifts, we want to be looking specifically at the clause of the award that tells us who they can apply to. So as we mentioned earlier, it can only apply to SACS-based employees if they're undertaking disability services work, and it does apply to home care employees. Outside of that, other people covered by the SCHADS Award cannot use the broken shifts provision. So generally speaking, when we're looking at a broken shift, the things that we need to keep in mind is that we're paying a broken shift allowance. So that is spelt out in our allowances clause, at clause 20 of the award, and that amount will go up with the new financial year, I expect. So keep an eye out for those changes. We need to make sure that each part of that shift component meets the minimum shift requirements we looked at before. So that will be in a broken shift a minimum of 2 hours for each part of work. So we can break that shift up into 2 components of work. If we're breaking it up into 3, that actually can only be done by mutual agreement with the employee, and it is an increased broken shift allowance. So just be cautious of that as well. in terms of those parts, as we said, we need to be meeting the minimum engagement for each part. And we need to keep in mind as well what this span of hours is over a broken shift. So what we see, particularly, I want to say off the top of my head, subsection of this clause that tells us that a broken shift can only essentially span for 12 hours. And after 12 hours, we're paying double time. So when I say double time, that is a 200% penalty payment that's essentially calculated as double time of a permanent rate. If we're casual, we're plussing at 25% casual loading on top, and that is considered OTE, ordinary time earnings for payroll, not overtime. So making sure we've got those payment codes separated in payroll is going to be really important to ensure compliance here. So as an example, if I had a broken shift that was 6 a.m. till 9 a.m. in the morning, and then 4 p.m. till 7 p.m. In the afternoon, that last hour has ticked me over into that 200% penalty payment, because I've started at 6 a.m. So anything after 6 p.m. will attract that rate. So we want to make sure that we're being strategic with how we rostered broken shifts. In terms of, can we have a sleepover and a broken shift? The award is actually silent on this. Generally speaking, they don't mix. And when we think about the why, it's because when we look at this 12-hour span of hours, we can see how very quickly putting a broken shift before or after a sleepover shift is going to tick us over into this hugely inflated wage cost, which is not going to be sustainable on your roster moving forward. So, maybe in those dire straits scenarios where we need someone to cover it, but we should never see a broken shift and a sleepover together on some kind of base or template roster in that way. Sleepovers. This is a very common shift structure that we do see. Just so we're on the same page, when we're defining a sleepover, and this is covered under the SCHADS Award, a sleepover is defined when an employee is required to sleep overnight at the premises where the client is located and is not 24-hour care shift or an excursion. So that's really, really particular there. So we're talking about the place where the client is usually residing and usually sleeping. What we have here is we have a sleepover allowance, which is currently $57.99. Again, will go up next week, so keep your eyes peeled for those changes. And that's just to cover the environmental factors of being away overnight. Doesn't cover any work to be performed. That doesn't cover anything else. So we need to be paying sleepover allowance. We need to be rostering a minimum of 4 hours either before or after a sleepover. So to be clear, that's not 2 hours on one side, 2 hours on the other, equaling 4 hours total. It must be 4 hours together on one side or the other. So it takes our minimum shift rules beforehand and flips it on its head and makes it very confusing for you. But this is very important and has been confirmed by the Fair Work Ombudsman as a matter of interpretation. We must have that minimum 4 hours. The other side, however, doesn't need to abide by any minimum engagement rule. It could be no hours. It could be 1 hour. It could be 2 hours. It could be 3 hours. The other side essentially doesn't have that minimum to abide by. So what I mean by that is you might have a sleepover that consists of active supports between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. for an evening routine. I'm going to have a sleepover period for 8 hours. It must be 8 hours, not